in jazz. They talk about the monsters of jazz, like Charlie Parker and Thelonious Monk, and people who are so good they're scary. Right? And so Nagarjuna is so good he's scary. Most of what we'll talk about comes from the fundamental wisdom of the middle way, and this was his main treatise on emptiness, one of many. He was quite prolific, and it's a poem. I don't know if all of his writings are in poem form or not, but this is a letter to a friend, which was an emperor. It's also in a poem form. As far as I know, he just simply wrote in poetry. He didn't write in what we call prose. So this is we have one of these in the library. I believe it's in the non-lending library, but you're certainly welcome to use it. The Shambhala Dictionary of Buddhism and Zen. Shambhala is a publishing house, as some of you know. This was these definitions were written by people who were actually Buddhists, people who were Tibetan, people who were Zen, and so forth. And I think the third was a scholar, 3 different people. So it's called the Shambhala Dictionary of Buddhism and Zen. I recommend it to you. It not only gives you definitions of the terms and the names of people and so forth, but it has these little arrows that point at another word, saying, that you should also look this word up if you're looking at this, right? So you can kind of follow a links through here to sort of get various viewpoints on a given person or teaching. So just briefly, Nagarjuna, one of the most important philosophers of Buddhism and the founder of the Madhyamika school, I don't know how that's pronounced. Hardly any reliable dates for his life, 2nd or 3rd century, are known. Numerous works are attributed to him, were probably written by various other authors. His most important authentic work is the Mula Madhyamaka Karika, Memorial Verses on the Middle Teaching, which is the one we'll be looking at in a little bit more detail. Contains the essentials of Nagarjuna's thought in 27 short chapters, or 400 verses. Now remember, this is a term you often hear used in philosophy, Nagarjuna's thought, right? And it's kind of a contradiction or an anomaly in Zen because, like, Dogen is said to have been Japan's greatest thinker. Now he's recognized as Japan's greatest thinker. When you look at what Dogen is teaching, he's teaching non-thinking. Right? So there's a bit of an anomaly there, which I find charming. Nagarjuna is also considered the author of these other pieces that they list here. And in the Zen tradition, he is considered the 14th patriarch of the Indian lineage. So his major, and as I mentioned before, his Buddha, 25 years ago, Nagarjuna is 14th, and then Bodhidharma is 28th. So Nagarjuna is halfway through Bodhidharma, going to China, bringing this practice to China. His major accomplishment was a systematization and deepening of the teaching presented in the Prajnaparamita Sutra, which is the condensed version, is the one that we chant every day or every service. So he developed a special dialectic based on a reductio ad absurdum of opponents' positions, starting with the premise that each thing exists only in virtue of its opposite. He shows that all things are only relative and without essence, and are empty. So they were known to hold public debates, he and his followers, and one of the terms, I think it's Madhyamika, means makes no assertions. The idea was that you would come with your proposition as a pundit, and there's a lot of people watching, so it was like TV of the day. So you were gonna be publicly embarrassed or whatever if you would win or lose one of these debates. And apparently, all that Nagarjuna's team, or he as a individual, would do is just demolish your assertions one after the other. So you're left with the rug pulled out from under you. Nothing to, not a toehold is often said in Zen, or not a leg to stand on. So the idea, what passes for a debate today, thank you, you can see is kind of a mudslinging contest. This is every 10 minutes? 15, okay. In those days, the objective of the debate was to help your opponent have a spiritual insight. And if you just contrast that with what we think of as debate today, it's stunning, mind-blowing. So, touching on the letter to a friend very briefly, says some interesting things in here. He is generally, that is Nagarjuna, considered with Asanga to be the most important figure in Mahayana Buddhism. Mahayana means great vehicle, the great vehicle. Hinayana is the lesser vehicle. And I think the two are sometimes thought of as early Buddhism and mature Buddhism. Mahayana being based on the idea that unless all are saved, how can anyone be saved? Hinayana seemed to have been based on the idea, and I'm not a scholar, that you could individually save yourself from this situation that we're born into. So the Buddha himself predicted that Nagarjuna would be born 400 years after his own parinirvana, and he would live 600 years. And this, in fact, correlates with the dates most scholars attribute to him, probably not the 600-year part, which lies somewhere around the 1st and 2nd century of the Christian era, falling roughly in the middle of the period foretold by Buddha. So it goes on into some detail on his life and about this king, Surabhadra, that he's writing to. A brief overview says, given that this poem, Nagarjuna's poem, condenses the entire Bodhisattva path, and the Bodhisattva's path is sort of the Mahayana school or the Zen school. A Bodhisattva is an enlightening being, somebody who puts the all others before oneself to help all others cross to the other shore. Enlightening being to help bring people to their own enlightenment and so forth. It condenses the entire Bodhisattva path into 123 four-line verses with a structural outline running to several pages, going back some 20 levels deep. It's not always easy to keep track of the direction the text is taking. Following a general overview may therefore prove helpful, particularly for those unfamiliar with the classical structural outline. So apparently Nagarjuna was following some pretty classical structures in his way of doing this exposition. And he goes into some detail saying that these are, it starts with, he begins with an introduction with a commitment to compose the text, and following by encouraging the reader and so forth, how to read it properly. It starts with 6 subjects common to all Buddhist vehicles: the 3 jewels, the 3 Buddha Dharma Sangha, and the value of positive actions, generosity, and discipline. Those are the paramitas, perfections. And then he moves into the 6 transcendent perfections, the paramitas, which make up the bulk of the poem. We know these as form, feeling, thought, impulse. No, that's the 5. That's the 5 paramitas. What's the 6th one? Anybody know?
Did you mention consciousness? Oh, consciousness.
Consciousness itself. So, and then he goes into concentration, verses 21 through 44 and so forth. And then comes to the heart of his subject, dedicating no less than 70 verses, 45 through 115, about half the poem, to the perfection of wisdom. Prajna Paramita means perfecting of wisdom. Prajna means wisdom. Paramita means perfection or perfecting as an activity. And that's what this whole set of sutras is directed towards, the perfecting of wisdom. So in the letter to a friend, this book, Nagarjuna's discussion of the 2 truths, 2 truths are absolute and relative, consists mainly of an extensive analysis of relative truth and so forth. So Nagarjuna rounds off this highly condensed description of the Bodhisattva path with 3 or 4 verses of encouragement, reassuring the king that the path, however difficult it may seem, is possible even for ordinary individuals. So this is where I think Nagarjuna's teaching has a social connection with us. We are lay practice people. We're not monks. We're not sort of living in the deep end of the pool. We're willing to swim into that end once in a while, but we're living, quote, normal lives, right? And so stick to the essential and do your best, he says, before concluding his poem with the traditional dedication of merit, in which he gives us a glimpse of the final result, Buddhahood. We'll look at just a few select sections of that to give you the flavor of it. But he goes on to say, some people might reasonably wonder whether a classical text in the form of advice addressed to an Indian king living almost 2,000 years ago has much relevance for members of Western society in the 21st century. And the same caveat I would say for the major work, how much relevance could this possibly have for us? And yet, as we read the letter, it is worth asking yourself what sort of person Nagarjuna's friend, in quotes, is, on the assumption that the author's advice was originally intended for King Surabhadra personally, along with his court, perhaps, and that he did not go out of his way to flatter him. We can glean a number of clues as to the king's character from the text itself. Despite leading a busy court life with the usual responsibilities of royalty, he appears already to have a good knowledge of the Buddha's teaching, which comes up in verse 3. And Nagarjuna makes frequent allusions to passages in the sutras, which must assume more than a passing acquaintance with the latter. So this king had to be educated in the sutras. The manner in which Nagarjuna addresses him would suggest that the king is essentially a good and indeed devout man, though at the same time prone to distraction and easily enticed by the pleasures of court life. Who would have thunk? Nagarjuna evidently feels it is necessary to warn him to keep a roving eye off other people's wives, verse 21. And as for the king's own marriage, Nagarjuna clearly considers it important to give him some advice on the matter and devotes no less than 2 verses to this. Nor does he allow the king a few mild fantasies as to the life he can expect in the celestial realms as a reward for suitable behavior in the present life. It reminds him that even the greatest happiness that might result from positive deeds is bound to end. So, this is kind of funny. Elsewhere, verse 33, for example, Nagarjuna bids the king against other temptations to which it seems he might easily fall prey. And the admonition not to prowl around at night comes as something of a surprise if we are to take it as a reflection on the king's habits. At least he wasn't tweeting, right? Okay, again, the essential advice on eating habits a few verses later would suggest that Surabhadra is something of a bon vivant. Yet when it comes to practicing the Buddhist path, he would seem to be prone to doubts, for shortly before concluding his letter, Nagarjuna provides a few lines of reassurance. The great bodhisattvas were all once perfectly ordinary people like you, he tells him. So you can be sure that you will get enlightened too. So if some of the above is speculative, it hopefully provides a picture of Nagarjuna's friend as an essentially human person, prone to the weaknesses and doubts we all have in common. So we may not be heads of state or wealthy aristocrats, but many Buddhists in the West do share with King Surabhadra a relatively comfortable background and lifestyle, and no shortage of worldly distractions. Seen in this light, Nagarjuna's advice is as valid and contemporary as it was when he wrote it. So I would say similarly for the fundamental wisdom of the middle way, So just quick, does anybody have any comment or questions so far? Let's launch right into this. So this is a translation of the Tibetan text of Mula Madhyamaka Rika. It is perhaps an odd idea to translate a Tibetan translation of a Sanskrit text and to retranslate a text which there are 4 extant English versions. My reasons for doing so are these. First, I'm not satisfied with any of the other English versions. Every translation, this one included, of any text embodies an interpretation, and my interpretation differs in various respects from those of my predecessors in this endeavor. So he goes on to explain a lot about translation. And I wanted to mention that when you go into the deep end of the pool and you start reading these texts, you're dealing with all of the issues that come from translation. And this is, for example, this is Sotoshu Sutras. This is printed by Sotoshu Japan, but it has what is called Romanji, in other words, pronunciation in English letters of the Japanese on one side, has the English on the other side. And this book has all of the table of contents. All of the Japanese names of all of these are in the table of contents. Table of contents here, table of contents here. Same table of contents, even though one is the English side and one is the Japanese pronunciation side. A later edition of this, I'm using this as an example of something, has all of the table of contents on one side, and then it has them in English, and then it has them in the Japanese. It's still the English on one side and the Japanese pronunciation on the other, but it's a much bigger book, as you can see. And so that's the other point here that he is making about how these other 4 translations are out there, but this process of translation is just an ongoing thing. It's never ending. It's just continuing with new translations. And Okamura Roshi, one of my teachers, is very active in translation. And so he, just to conclude here, matters, interpretations and with them translations will continue to evolve as our understanding of the text evolves and our interpretive horizon changes. Matters even more complex and indeterminate when the translation crosses centuries, traditions, and languages, and sets of philosophical assumptions that are quite distant from one another, as is the case in the present project. And I also wanted to say that this is presented from a scholarly, he says this is not a critical scholarly edition of the text. It is not philological. I don't even know what that means. You know what philological means?
Study of words, the history of words, etymology, and so on.
Okay. Nor is it discussion of the commentary of literature. So he's trying to explain the particular approach that he's taking here as compared to the others. And so what I wanted to say is that he is presenting this as he says, I'm striving for that elusive middle path between 2 other extremes in translation, trying on the one hand to avoid the unreadable literalism of translations that strive to provide a verbatim report of the words used in the original, regardless of whether that results in a comprehensible English text. There's, on the other hand, the extreme presented by translation written in lucid English prose purporting to be what the original author would have written had he been a 20th century philosopher writing in English, or one that, in an attempt to convey what the text really means on some particular interpretation, is in fact not a translation of the original text, but a completely new book bearing only a distant relation to the original. This hopelessly mixes the task of translation on the one hand, critical commentary on the other. So these tasks are intertwined, and he's trying to strike a good balance here. But I wanted to say that amongst practitioners, we consider the real meaning of these texts to be experiential. That is not in language. And so you can see what the translators are struggling with to try to take what is expressed in language, but based on experience, right? And translate that into another language and carry the meaning of it, not knowing whether the translator himself or herself really has any experience of this. So this is a unique issue. That's a different kind of translation. So I just wanted to show you its examination of, and here's the part 1 is the text of the all the way down to number 27. And then here's text and commentary. He just goes through it again with his commentary. So it's examination of conditions, motion, the senses, the aggregates, elements, desire and the desirous, the condition, examination of the agent and action, examination of the prior entity, whatever that means, examination of fire and fuel, of the initial and final limits, examination of suffering, examination of compounded phenomena, examination of connection, examination of essence, examination of bondage, examination of actions and their fruits, examination of self and entities, examination of time, examination of combination, examination of becoming and destruction, examination of the Tathagata, which is an honorific that we just chanted in the opening verse for Buddha himself. Tathagata means something like the thus come one who experiences thusness or reality. Examination of errors. And then number 24, examination of the Four Noble Truths. Examination of nirvana as it comes next. Examination of the 12 links and examination of views. Joe, would you do me a favor and go in the lending library and get one of those, get those charts that I set those teachings out in a graphic way? They're in the bookstore. Okay, some of our newcomers haven't seen those, so that would make some of those. So you can see what he's doing is he's examining all the fundamental teachings of Buddhism, one thing, one sort of item at a time. So I'm going to wait for Joe to come back before I start reading a little bit from this, starting with the examination of conditions, which is the first section. There's a dedicatory verse, which I'll read. I prostrate to the perfect Buddha, the best of teachers, who taught that whatever is dependently arisen is unceasing, unborn, unannihilated, not permanent, not coming, not going, without distinction, without identity, and free from conceptual construction. So here he's pointing at just anybody who's already seen that, they don't need to see it, but just anybody who wants to take a look at it. That's a mnemonic, a graphic, semantic modeling of Buddhist 5 fundamental Mahayana teachings, including the Four Noble Truths, the 12-fold chain that was just mentioned that he deals with in here. We're not going to go into great detail on any of this. So he's saying, at one at the same time, he's saying, whatever is dependently arisen is free from conceptual construction. And then we're going to go into this long 123-verse poem. You say, well, isn't that a conceptual construction? Well, of course, but what it's pointing at is not. Right? So again, it's a use of language to try to point at something which is not in language. It's not accessible in language. You can't say that. Words can point at it. It's not beyond words, as the Chinese poem says. The other thing I found in going through this again is all of the foundations of the Chinese texts that we chant. We have the three. We have trust in mind. We have harmony of sameness and difference. And we have the precious mirror samadhi from roughly from 600, 700, and 800. You hear echoes of those teachings from those great Chinese masters in what Nagarjuna is saying here. So just to give you a flavor of the language, I'm going to start with the examination of conditions. And every one of these is an examination of something. So conditions, everything that is co-arisen is said to be a matter of causes and conditions. And he goes in later into combinations of cause and condition and distinguishing what's different about a cause and a condition. What is a condition and what is a cause, and how are they different? So it starts taking your brain apart a little bit, right? You start getting this cognitive dissonance setting in place. Think, wait a minute, where am I? So here he goes. He says, neither from itself, nor from another, nor from both, nor without a cause, does anything whatever anywhere arise. Let me say that again. Neither from itself, nor from another, nor from both, nor without a cause, does anything whatever anywhere arise. That's the first verse. Where do we go from here, right? And he says there are four conditions: efficient condition, perceptive object condition, immediate condition, dominant condition, just so. There is no fifth condition. So you get the idea this guy knows what he's talking about, because he's telling you, don't start looking for a fifth condition. There aren't any. Those are the four. So let me see if I can find the commentary on that. It's a section I like is on time. Has anybody read Uji Dogen's, Master Dogen's Being Time or Existence Time? Well recommended for anybody living in the 21st century. So he says there are four conditions: efficient condition, percept object condition, immediate condition, dominant condition. Just so. There is no fifth condition. So the commentary by the author here is the general classification of conditions Nagarjuna employs is pretty standard in Indian and especially in Buddhist accounts of explanation. So once again, he's not varying far from the the standard. But there are two specific features of Nagarjuna's presentation that should be noted. First, since his writing was specifically soteriological goals in mind, meaning salvation, this is about your salvation, which require the practitioner to develop a deep insight into the nature of his or her own mind, there is a specifically psychological emphasis in the presentation. We must be aware both of this emphasis and of the natural generalization away from that particular domain that the account supports. Second, it will be of paramount importance to Nagarjuna that the analysis of the relation of conditions to the conditioned involves ascribing neither inherent existence nor causal power to the conditions. So the percept object condition is, in its primary sense, the object in the environment that is the condition for the mind's perception of it, such as this lectern. Now, things get vexed here in a number of ways. First, there's no unanimity in the world, or even in Buddhist philosophy, regarding the analysis of perception, and hence no consensus on the view just adumbrated, that external objects are the percept object conditions of perceptual awareness. He goes on to the difference between idealists and realists and so forth. We're not going to go into. But he uses an example here. He says, the dominant condition is the purpose or end for which an action is undertaken. My hope for understanding of Madhyamika might be the dominant condition for my reading Nagarjuna's text. Its presence before my eyes, the percept object condition, the reflected light striking my eyes, the efficient condition. The immediate conditions are the countless intermediary phenomena that emerge upon the analysis of a causal chain, such as the 12-fold chain there. In this case, the photon striking my retina, the excitation of photoreceptor cells, and so forth. So, Buddhism, the Indians were capable of slicing and dicing this down to, the micro world. In fact, Buddha was asked, what happens if you cut something in half, and you cut the half in half again, and the half in half again, until you get down to the last particle of that, and you cut that in half. And Buddha was said to answer, then you're right on the edge of form and emptiness. So that would be where we enter into our understanding of physics, right? So a non-psychological example might be useful to illustrate the difference between the four kinds of condition and the picture Nagarjuna suggests of explanation in the most general sense. Suppose that you ask, why are the lights on? I might reply as follows, because I flicked the switch. Actually, Matt did. Matt flicked the switch. I have appealed to an efficient condition. Okay, that explains very practical terms why they're on. Or two, because the wires are in good working order, the bulbs haven't burned out, and the electricity is flowing. These are supporting conditions. Or three, the light is the emission of photons, each of which is emitted in response to the bombardment of an atom by an electron, and so forth. I have appealed to a chain of immediate conditions. Or four, so that we can see. This is the dominant condition. This is the motive underlying why we turn the lights on in the first place. Any of these would be a perfectly good answer to the why question, but note that none of them makes any reference to causal powers or necessitation. So this starts to give you a flavor of how deep a dive this gets to be. I want to jump to a couple of others, but let me stop there for a minute and let's see if we can reboot a little bit. Anybody have anything on that?
Can I ask, when he says this doesn't, none of these refer to any causal chain, it seems like they do when you talk about atoms and electrons generating photon creation, photon emission, colliding with those. That's a causal chain.
It is in the West, but it's not in this context. Those causes are also conditions, and you cannot prove that one causes the other. That's the argument. It's like we say, okay, if I want to have insight, I need to sit in meditation. Right? We cannot prove a causal connection between meditation and enlightenment. It can't be shown. Can't be found. But when you get into the micro world of these, and you're in neurology, right?
Yeah.
So you get into the micro world of the organic chemistry, you get into the micro world of electricity, you enter the realm of quantum mechanics where it can go either way. It's not, you can't really prove that, like for instance, we say you can't unscramble eggs, but that does not prove an arrow of time. It just proves that those processes of scrambling the eggs can't be reversed. Doesn't show that time is only moving in one direction. So it's gnarly.
Does the causality also deal with the idea of intentionality rather than specific intervention and reaction?
Well, in terms of the efficient cause or the dominant cause, that would be your intentions so we can see, right? So see what they're parsing it into all of these classes of kinds of condition. So they have what they call the tetralemma, something. It is, it is not, it both is and is not, it neither is nor is not. Those are 4 propositions around one statement of reality, called tetralemma. That's 4 parts, minimal 4 parts. So fortunately, this author is a philosopher trained in philosophy, and he understands Western philosophy. And so some of his commentary goes into, as he said, his purpose of this book is to make this clear, more clear, to a Western philosophical perspective. So let me jump to time, which I really encourage you to read Uji. Examination of time, very brief. Not very many. So I'm going to read the whole thing quickly. If the present and the future depend on the past, then the present and the future would have existed in the past. If the present and the future did not exist there, how could the present and the future be dependent upon it? If they are not dependent upon the past, neither of the two would be established, present and future. Therefore, neither the present nor the future would exist. By the same method, the other 2 divisions, past and future, upper, lower, middle, etc., unity, etc., should be understood. So this is referring, the etc. is referring to some other classes. A non-static time is not grasped. Get that again? A non-static time is not grasped. This is equivalent to the line that triggered Huineng's awakening it's not equivalent, but it's parallel in the Platform Sutra, the Diamond Cutter Sutra, where it said the true mind is that which clings to nothing or sticks nowhere. This illustrating the dynamic nature of reality. And Buddha was said to have taught that the monkey mind, citta, imposes a false stillness on reality. So this description of this process of waking up means your reality becomes more and more dynamic. Right. So a non-static time is not grasped. Nothing one could grasp as stationary time exists. If time is not grasped, how is it known? If time depends on an entity, then without an entity, how could time exist? There is no existent entity. So how can time exist? We in the West tend to think of time as a dimension. So we think there's X, Y, Z, right? And then there's time. But if you reduce time to another dimension, you're trying to give it a tangible attribute, which it doesn't seem to have. So here he mentions the trying to see where to start here. So remember, he was talking about grasping time, and here this is examination of the Tathagata, examination of one who apprehends suchness, one who apprehends this reality as it is, without these conceptual, without these conceptual constructions about it. What, being neither identical nor different, can be thought to be the Tathagata through grasping? Remember, the Tathagata is not talking about Shakyamuni Buddha. It is, and that's talking about your consciousness. What is the original mind? Tathagata would be an equivalent term for your original mind. Remember, our mind, chitta, discriminating mind, basically works through grasping language, grasping concepts, and so forth. So he's challenging the very idea that the grasping mind can reach this. Matsuoka Roshi had an example. He'd say, if you grasp the incense smoke, or you try to, it evades your grasp. If you stop grasping, the incense smoke will embrace your palm. So this is Master Dogen's backward step, letting it come to us, not chasing after it. Elsewhere, he says to carry yourself forward to the myriad things and experience the myriad things is delusion. That the myriad things come forth and experience themselves is awakening. So this is 180-degree different from how we learn to learn, right? This is saying something, you can't do this, you have to let this happen. You can't make it happen. So what, being neither identical nor different, can be thought to be the Tathagata through grasping? Whatever grasping there is does not exist through essence. And when something does not exist through itself, it can never exist through otherness essence. Thus, grasping and grasper together are empty in every respect. How can an empty Tathagata be known through the empty? Empty should not be asserted. Non-empty should not be asserted. Neither both nor neither should be asserted. They are only used nominally. So emptiness is pointing at something that is real, true. But if you assert emptiness, one of the Chinese poems says, denying the reality of things misses their reality. Asserting the emptiness of things misses their reality. The more we talk and think about it, the further astray we wander from the truth. Stop talking and thinking, there's nothing you will not be able to know. So, thus, grasping and grasper together are empty in every respect. How can an empty Tathagata be known through the empty? And how can your mind, in other words, your empty mind, original mind, be known through the empty? Empty should not be asserted as real, in other words. Non-empty should not be asserted as the reality. Neither both nor neither should be asserted. They are only used nominally to point you to this experience. Once you have this experience, then you know what this is talking about, but you know it experientially. You can't know it verbally. So how can the tetralemma, which is this four-pointed model of permanent and impermanent, etc., be true of the peaceful? So here's the human element, right? We become peaceful because of this. But how can the tetralemma of permanent and impermanent, it's permanent? No, it's impermanent. No, it's both permanent and impermanent. No, it's neither permanent nor impermanent. That's the tetralemma. How can that be true of peace, being at peace? So I think that's a big one. Then I think maybe, how are we doing on time? If you have 10 minutes. Let me just read a little bit of the commentary of the author on time, and the examination of time. Another response to the attack on the reality of action and its consequences might be to argue that nonetheless the time in which action such action and its consequences are realized must be real, the time in which these actions. There's a prior argument contradicting the side that all actions have consequences. You know, that's a reality. In other words, karma is unavoidable. We're trapped in karma. We can't get free of karma. Now, this is sort of the fatalist interpretation of Buddhist teaching. Nagarjuna, that at least the time in which it happens has to be real. This is the examination of time. Nagarjuna, in this chapter, which is a very brief one as we saw, argues that time cannot be conceived of as an entity existing independently of temporal phenomena, but must itself be regarded as a set of relations among them. So this is pretty much the essence of Buddha's or Dogen's argument of Uji, existence time, hyphenated, or being hyphen time. There's no time without being. There's no being without time. There's no existence without time. There's no time without existence. And so like form and emptiness, when you say one, you're already saying the other. Right? It's not that this equals that. You can't separate them to declare them equal. So in this chapter, he argues that time cannot be conceived of as an entity existing independently of temporal phenomena, but must itself be regarded as a set of relations among them. So this lectern and I are in contact in time, right? And this will change. I will change. This will not be the same. It's not even the same right now that it was when I first said that, right? And in the future, that will be much more evident as this thing decays and I get old and die. Right? It's constantly like that. So it's a set of time is a set of relations amongst things. His arguments are closely akin to those of Zeno. You've heard of Zeno's paradox. Sextus and McTaggart. By the way, those of you familiar with Zeno, meaning, isn't it the arrow, the spear can't reach the target because it has to go halfway? It has to go halfway. It has to go half the remaining half. It has to go the other, cutting half. You can't ever get there because there's always a distance left, and it has to go half of that distance first. So if you read Dogen on Uji being time, he puts forth the Buddhist theory or hypothesis that actually the entire universe is arising, abiding, changing, and decaying in a KSANA, shana. It's a Sanskrit term for the smallest particle of time. And he calculates that there's 600 and so many of those in a snap of the fingers. It's not a moment like we'd say, that was a moment. That was less than a second, so we call it a moment. No, he's saying it's in the microsecond. It is the fundamental particle or duration of time. What is the smallest duration of time? Shana. In physics, the Planck constant is the physical equivalent to that. The smallest space, what is the smallest possible? So he does this calculation. He comes up with so many millions of these in a 24-hour day are passing by. And the way I like, and he said, if this weren't happening, that everything is arising, abiding, changing, and decaying every micro moment, enlightenment would be impossible. You could never become free of your karma. Same argument we were discussing earlier, right? For everything to change, be capable of change, that's the only way we can be free of karma, the karmic consequences of our past. So he stretched it to make that argument. The way I think of it is the reality has a refresh rate, just like your monitor, right? Cats don't see cat TV unless their brains are in the same frequency as we see the mouse or the bird and they swat at it, right? Other cats sit there, they don't see anything but the rafters because their frequency is not the same. As we get older, frequency on our nervous system slows down. That's why everything seems to be speeding up. Right? These two are in sync with each other. So if you think of reality as having a refresh rate, it's just extremely rapid, right? And the kinds of changes we begin to experience on a sensory level, LSD, for that matter, chemicals, I would say we could propose that those are resonances on that fundamental chana, on that fundamental frequency. What was his name? David, physicist at Georgia Tech, who came and gave us several. He's deceased now, but he called it the chronon. He said he was spending the last part of his life in physics looking for the chronon, that fundamental particle of time. What is the smallest? So that was an aside. Nagarjuna's method is to divide time into the past, the present, and the future, and then to argue that none of these can be said to inherently exist. In these first two verses, he considers one horn of an implicit dilemma. The present and the future either depend on the past or they do not. In these two verses, he considers the possibility that they do depend upon the past. But if they depended on it in any sense that could plausibly guarantee their inherent existence, they must somehow emerge from it as a basis. If so, he argues, they must have existed in the past. Otherwise, how can they emerge from it? For if they did not, then we would have the situation where when the time on which they ostensibly depend exists, they do not exist. Say that again. For if they did not, then we would have the situation where when the time on which they ostensibly depend exists, they do not exist, or a situation where at the time they exist, that on which they ostensibly depend does not exist. We would then either have the situation in which the ostensibly dependent exists, but in the absence of that on which it depends, or in which the necessary condition exists, but without that of which it is the condition. So I certainly recommend Nagarjuna. I think we may have lost my voice here. But that's what you're going to get into. Now, other things are used to explain other things like life and death. And the metaphor, they used oil lamps in Dogen's time at least, and probably in India, I'm not sure. But they say death can come about through various causes and conditions, right? Like an oil lamp, you can run out of fuel, and then the flame goes out, right? The flame is the life. Or the wick, I think gradually you have to trim these wicks off, right? Because they burn. You have to advance the wick till finally you can run out of wick, right? And then something can come along and blow the flame out. So the flame, the life, called the karmic line and the lifeline, are seen as complementary, but in a sense separate. They're merged, much like the other dualities they're talking about here. So your life can be ended by something cutting you off. Somebody runs over you with a truck, right? And so your lifeline isn't, but your karmic line isn't yet ended. This is how they explain the impetus to rebirth. Karmic isn't done yet, and so it comes back in another form to continue. The old Hinayana view is that your karmic life can end, and yet your lifeline is still continuing, which means you become what is called an arhat, or an arhat, something like that. A never returner, a person who has accomplished this reality, right, and is done. And theoretically, then your behavior, your actions become non-karmic because you don't have a dog in the hunt. You're not doing anything for any intentional purpose, self-centered gain, or anything of that nature. So anyway, that's about Nagarjuna. And we're right at the end of the time, but let's go around and see if people have questions or comments they want to raise. Anything, Yoji?
Well, maybe I just misunderstood, but no. I was just thinking, when he was talking about how the present and future aren't in the past, I was thinking of karmic seeds and how if I kick the beehive just a few seconds later, the past does affect.
Do a cake with beehives.
Okay.
We have an actual beehive out back.
Maybe I know that you talked about karma. It was just saying though that the present and future are somewhat in the past based upon karmic seeds that are sown in the past. And what I do in the past affects the present and the future.
Right. Well, let's take a run at it with Dogen's firewood metaphor. He says, firewood becomes ash and does not become firewood again after it is ash. Yet do not suppose that the ash is future and the firewood past. Firewood exists in the phenomenal expression of firewood, which fully includes both future and past, and is independent of future and past. So it both includes and is independent of. And then he goes on to say, ash abides in the phenomenal expression of ash, which fully includes past and future. Just as firewood does not become firewood again after it is ash, you do not return to birth after death. So this is the way he uses a metaphor to lead into talking about birth and death and how Buddhism sees birth and death as points on a continuum. So when the firewood is firewood, it fully includes, there's already past and future. It's as if you have these three things that are a Venn diagram, and they're all overlapped, you might say. They all overlap each other. And so they're both discrete, discontinuous, and continuous. This is where the teaching of Nagarjuna, emptiness, non-duality, becomes really difficult. Because we can only imagine it's either this or that, not that it's both, and simultaneously neither this or that, and. Right. That's the tetralemma that they talk about, the full explication of a logical proposition that you're trying to argue with yourself. This has to take in all four of those into account simultaneously. That's where the cognitive dissonance sets in, because those are contradictory ideas. Anything else on that, Goji?
Thank you.
No bite? You're not biting? April, you're a newcomer. So.
No, it's just like my brain is scrambled right now, but it'll resonate after a while. So, because what kept arising for me was dependent arising, but no. And then
The what arising?
dependent arising.
Dependent, yeah.
Yeah, arising and then no. And then it's causing conditions like, oh, so I just kept going back all over the place with the trying to hold it all. So we'll see what arises.
Keiko-san.
I like to try read.
You like what?
I like to try read Fuji and.
The wonderful thing about it is it's a really relatively brief poem. I would suggest reading through it quickly, then reading again and reading again, reading again. I do a lot of memorization, as I've mentioned often. I've memorized a lot of the texts by setting them to music. And when you memorize them, you start hearing them, learning them a different way. It's not like you're learning them through the words or something. It's like, oh, so that's got to be what that means, you know. So yeah, I'd recommend you do. And in Dogen, for instance, when you read Dogen, the Shobo Genso, read the whole fascicle without stopping. Just read through. Don't stop for footnotes or anything. And then go back and read it again. The first one just gives you the shape of it, you know. So I think part of what we're doing here is we're exploring how do we learn, right? And we can't learn this stuff the way we ordinarily learn everything else we learn, right? Yours may be a case where there's the same. Neuroscience may be the same. So why don't you read? You can borrow this one if you want. It's in our library.
Languages, Dogen and ancient Japanese, so sometimes it's easier learning reading in English.
Yeah. Well, you can hear this is interpreting Buddha from 14 generations before. And this is anticipating Bodhidharma going to China, and all the Chinese masters are resonating with this later. So he's like a bridge.
It reminded me of Kant.
Kant.
Thinking about
Well, here in the introduction, he refers to Kant.
Oh yeah, I kept thinking about time and the reason where he talks about how time can't be a substance of its own, because it wouldn't allow the other substances to exist, basically. And then he says time can't be a representation, time can't be a relationship between things, and I can't remember why he says that. But rather, time is like just a structure that the mind imposes on things to allow.
It might be that you would have to take the position of one of the things to discuss it as a relationship, and then you're not the other thing.
Yeah, so time just comes from the mind, then it's just a way
Yeah.
that you.
Motion, I wanted to get into the motion, the one on motion, because when we do Kinhin, we're moving the stillness of Zazen into motion and back. And Mokurai is this term that means stillness in motion, motion in stillness, which we're somewhat familiar with here. But if you think about it, in the motion argument, he says, how can one thing move relative to another, essentially? If you think of Einstein's thought experiments, it's like that. What's it like to be moving at the speed of light and something else is coming this way? How does time fit that, right? So if you think, I think a simple thing you can think about is that we have a center. We call it, samadhi. We become centered, and mine is in the middle of my being, and yours is in the middle of yours. They're not the same, and we move past each other. Every object in the universe has that. The sun has the center at the middle of the sun. The earth has the center at the middle of the earth, right? Relative to itself, it's not moving. Relative to everything else, it's moving, right? But you have to go sit on the sun to watch the earth go by, and you have to sit on the earth to watch the sun go by, right? So it depends on where you are. It's like personal relativity. I'm here, you're there. Light takes time, right? So I'm seeing you in the past, micromillisecond of the past, right? But these are the dimensions that this classical Buddhism gets into. It's really describing reality. I mean, how can it be that we have people in 7 different time zones who are all talking to each other at the same time on Skype or Zoom?
Trying to reconcile intuitive understanding of reality with this sort of presentation, and not sure I buy all of it yet, because I think on one level, causality is something we all experience. And Zeno's paradox is a great example of that. There's the interesting idea, but no one would volunteer to have me throw a spear at it, because they quickly discover the haves and the haves and the haves don't really matter. You're still going to get a spear through your chest. So there's there's the philosophy we can bend our minds to understand reality. And I think you started off saying it's experiential, but words have to make. So I feel like there's something there. I'm just not sure what it is yet.
Well, you understand that he's not denying causality at all. There's a famous old anecdote of Yakujo and the fox, where he pokes the fox out from under the bush and they give it a priest funeral. He explains that this was a Zen priest who was reborn as a fox because he once answered that question incorrectly. He was asked, is the enlightened person free from or subject to causality? And he answered, free from. So he was condemned to be reborn as a fox for 500 lives. So he came to Yakujo, and Yakujo explained to him. He said, please help me out of this. And so Yakujo said, the enlightened do not, variously translated, the enlightened do not deny causality, or the enlightened are one with causality. It's not a matter of denying it, it's just saying we're not caught in the dilemma of whether we're subject to it or free from it. That kind of duality.
Much to think on.
Yeah. Pakistan.
I think for sort of Zen practitioners to stay with this whole business of dependent arising, not give up on it, because that's dependent arising is considered to be the wisdom aspect of Buddha, or compassion and opening heart is the soft side. So seeing dependent arising is one way in which we're encouraged.
According to
Then it comes down to the self, not the self.
And ordinarily that's interpreted into psychological terms. It's like every time I do this, she does that. And every time she does this, I do that. And, in relational things. But it's a difference between interpreting Dogen's 4 transitions, study the way to study the self, forget the self, be enlightened by all things, remove the barrier between self and other, go on traceless enlightenment forever. The social psychological side is remove the barrier between self and others and apply this teaching to our relationships. the more fundamental side that this is getting at is self and other. Remove the barrier between self and other. Mind and object merge in in realization, in stillness, Mind and object merge in realization, go beyond enlightenment. That's more it's like the wisdom side, yes, but it's just the truth. It's just the fact, the unavoidable fact, And if you wake up to that, theoretically, it can bring about change on the social level as well, right? But this is definitely first in Zen, not being a better person coming first and learning socially. Sort of get yourself together on the cushion, and then your relationships will fall into place.
Was that from that text, mind and object merge? Was the mind and object merge?
No, that's in Dogen.
Dogen?
Yeah. Anything else on that, Coxon?
Thank you.
Joe, you're a philosopher. Here we go. We're in trouble.
It's just the same thing, everybody else is asking that, everything arises dependent on conditions. This is the basic teaching of Buddhism, and that's the idea behind impermanence.
And interconnectedness, too.
Yeah, that's one of the expressions, used in the text. None of these things exist inherently, which is, and this is the question then. That's to say that nothing has self-existence, nothing exists of its own. Everything is dependent on conditions, therefore everything is empty of self-existence. But, so the question, just for you to play with these. So to deny the cause, is that, on one level, I think it's easy to understand that, yes, even the cause is empty of inherent existence, of self-existence.
Mm-hmm.
So the cause does not exist. Nothing, but is there
not in the sense of that
more than that to what you're
well
saying?
take a example from biology or from life. You have a tree has a seed, and the seed grows. Its causes and conditions are proper, the seed will grow to be a tree, just like the parent tree or similar to the parent tree, right? So you say, well, if you cut open the tree, you can't find that seed, right? This is one of Dogen's famous aphorisms, I think, where you can't find a plum blossom by operating on the tree. It's not in there, But so if you go do an infinite regress on that, and you say, okay, this tree, another parent tree came before that, and we go back to Precambrian times, and they weren't trees in the way they are now, but this is where it came from, and there's an unbroken lineage, all the way back. And then you say, well, then before the earth was created, where is it then? Where's infinite regress back to what in Catholicism is called the first cause. And the first cause is always default God, right? The default is God created this, made this happen, right? But if you take the Buddhist approach and do the endless regress back, you don't find the first cause, right? And so this cause of the seed and the tree is all nominal causes. These are efficient causes, the kind of causes, conditions they were describing. They're called conditions because they're not the primal cause, right? Something else brought this existence about that is not these present proximate conditions that we can identify. And yet they all come from the same place originally. When you trace the source of the way, you find it is universal and absolute. Tracing the source of the way is trying to find that first cause, and Buddhism says, good luck. But that doesn't deny that there's causality. It's just not that simple kind of causality. All conditions are causes. All causes are conditions. Michael.
Well, let me first say this was pretty much intellectually humbling.
I think it's good to do this once in a while. I wouldn't do this every week.
Notwithstanding, it seems that all things Buddhism I do. I did fixate on one thing that I could understand, which is something you referred to as the translative horizon, where the interpretation.
Interpretive horizon, I think he
I
called
think
it,
it was okay. Interpretive horizon.
meaning the context in which we are
Well,
living and how we would interpret something from the past and try to interpret it in our present.
Which occurred to me that from drawings on caves to the Constitution has been an ongoing process throughout our human existence. You know, from art to literature
Mhm.
to conversation to debate is
Mhm.
the human beings need to interpret and be.
And that's where the trouble starts, I think.
Well, there's a vein to that existence, certainly, except as I see it, it doesn't, whether sentient being or Buddhist, it doesn't stop. I mean,
Mhm,
it is a condition regardless within
Mhm.
our human experience and the interpretation of
Mhm.
all these things is a desire that we all share.
Yeah, and we'd probably say human beings are the only interpretative sentient being. The others are probably not doing interpretation. Maybe dolphins
I
and
think
whales.
the focus of that is intriguing to me.
Mhm.
Because there is there's been a conversation on whether it's important to know and whether or not it's okay not to know. I mean, to some extent, there have been points even in
Right.
this conversation where the desire to know was
Right,
actually
right.
painful because there's
Right.
just no way you're going to
But
get
the don't know mind is highly revered in Zen, and I think it means some old guy said, "Not knowing you know is best."
Well,
So the interpretation I hold that when we're sitting in meditation, where we go astray is when we begin interpreting. And that doesn't mean that there's anything fundamentally bad about it and that we ultimately must interpret our own experience, right? And all of this amounts to an interpretation of experience, right? Experiential truth. So, but typically we would do that interpreting in a cultural milieu where we begin trying to understand it as an example of this or an example of that we're already familiar with. This is making the familiar strange. This is going into strange new territory where it's no longer familiar. And so it's not going to fit any of the categories that we use to understand where everything fits.
Yeah, I see the new frontier dynamic of that. But as someone,
I call it the original frontier. And by the way, it looks like a publisher is going to publish it.
yes, and that's an interesting point because I think we have had dialogue with the vast ocean of information about Buddhism. Is it important that you, me, us continue to fill that ocean with our own interpretation?
I think it's inevitable, and he makes the point in there that what else can you do? I mean, why would you, if you read these translations, right? I don't know if he's basing his criticism of them on his own experience and meditation, which would be the best place to come at it from, right? Or if he's basing it on more of a scholarly exegesis, or just, it's not clear what they're saying, and I think it really means this. He's going back to the Tibetan to translate it, so he's got some chops. So
here comes the question.
but I think we can't help. I'm a designer by profession, so I interpret things with the tools I have. I interpret things through design tools, right?
So why are we driven to interpret?
Because we need to know. Buddha sat down 2,500 years ago, admitted to himself in all humility with everything he knew. He didn't know fundamentally what he needed to know. I think that's why. I'm not sure.
I think I'm a very philosophical person, and this is one of the rare occasions when I have very little to say.
It's the beginning of wisdom. I've said too much.
I'm just reminded of an Alan Watts quote that the past cannot be said to cause the present any more than the wake of the ship can be said to push the ship. I don't think I understand that either, but I like that metaphor.
Yeah.
It just reminded me of the, that way of looking at things.
I don't know how that would stand up under analysis, but it's a good enough metaphor. So, Paul, anything?
I'm trying to bring into conversation two thoughts, one of which in quantum mechanics, the idea of a collapse of a probability front. That is to say, many things are possible,
right.
But when the object of attention focuses, others collapse.
Right. The possibilities collapse.
In conversation with the concept of conditions. So each set of explanations is appropriate for the moment. It collapses all other conditions until the attention moves to a different set of conditions. So when one asks, why this? And you respond, because this, for right now, or maybe not. So I'm trying to...
David Finkelstein, it was his name. I'm trying to remember his name. He explained something around the uncertainty principle when he was here one time that I never, I think it was a revelation for me anyway. And he said, I said, I understand it to be something like if you know the momentum of a particle, you can't know its location and vice versa. You say, if you know this, you can't know that. And he said, it's more than that. He said, if you know anything about it, all the rest of the information about it, you can't know. That's the only thing you can know. So it's more like what you're saying. There's this complex of all of these probabilities behind it that if you know one thing about it, that's it. That's all you can identify.
But that's okay.
That's okay. Brennan. And so, yes. The empty circle. Well, thank you for your patience and listening. I know this was not the kind of thing you go home and talk to mom about, but unless mom happens to be Einstein's wife. She did all the math, by the way. That's what we're told. So let's close with the Dharma closing verse. It's 3 bells and a stop. And we do the 4 vows 3 times. Beings are numberless, I vow to freedom. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to them. The harmony gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless, I vow to freedom. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless, I vow to freedom. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. Thank you for your patience and listening, for being here this morning. Thank you for your donations as well. Let's clean everything up. Somebody volunteer for teacups. Leave no traces. Put everything back where you found it. Dust your cushions.
Also, leave no traces is to pick up your crumbs.
Pick up your crumbs. Take these papers and put them back in the bookstore. If you'd like to buy one, we ask $5 for those. Does anybody want to read Nagarjuna? Anybody? Going once, going twice.
Oh, yeah. I was going to pick him up and then I saw you. So I didn't know where you got him.
Okay, Brennan, it's yours. Just sign it out in the library.
I'd love to talk to you. Yeah, I actually like.
Since they mix their user D2, we'd like you to know that Sin Beam Sutra sounds great as a country western ballad.
Who said that?
I don't know their given name, but their screen name is D2.
That's one of the pieces I set to music. But the Mokarai is the one that came off as a country song. I call it Sekido Kisen meets Willie Nelson.
The funny thing was, is like,